Have you ever walked away from everything you've built just because of a pair of eyes staring at you from the dark? In Lewis County, Washington, a veteran deputy turned in his badge after 17 years on the force. No one forced him. No accident. No scandal. Just one silent encounter with something towering 9 feet tall, its eyes glowing in the headlights, deep in the forest. Most people never hear stories like this because they don't want you to. I'm Jackson Holt, former war correspondent, now digging into the cases that never made the evening news. In the hollow at Cinderbrush, I uncover what others are too afraid to say out loud, and the truth behind why that entire region is now under unofficial curfew after 10 p.m. This happened in November 2022. His name was Cole Travis, 44 years old. I have the radio log. His last words before going dark were, "It's watching me." If you skip this, you'll never know what's really living in those woods. Episode 1 is only available for the next 72 hours. Listen, before it disappears. It was supposed to be just another quiet night in Lewis County. Deputy Alan Ree had driven that winding forest road dozens of times. Narrow, cracked, flanked by trees so thick the headlights could barely slice through. He was alone. Standard protocol for a final sweep through Cinderbrush Hollow, a stretch of woodland the locals didn't even whisper about after dark. 16 years on the force. Military background. Alan wasn't the type to scare easily. People trusted him to walk into what others ran from. But something about the silence that night felt wrong. Too clean. Like the forest itself was holding its breath. As his cruiser crept past a bend, everything changed in a flash. The high beams caught something. Someone? No, something. Standing upright in the middle of the road. Massive. Drenched in matted black hair. 9 feet tall with a barrel chest and arms that nearly brushed the asphalt. For one heartbeat, they stared at each other. Neither moved. Neither blinked. The world shrank into that beam of light. Alan opened his door slowly, cautiously stepping out. Maybe it was a bear. Maybe he was tired. But before his second foot even hit the ground, the creature moved, silent and sudden. It grabbed a tree limb, thick as a lamppost, and hurled it like a javelin. The windshield shattered in a spray of glass and the hood of the cruiser crumpled like foil. If Alan had stood a moment longer, he'd have been a smear under 1,000 pounds of splintered wood. The air turned metallic, sharp, like burnt iron and blood. And the shadows behind the creature, they didn't move with the wind. They pulsed, as if the trees themselves recoiled. Alan's instincts screamed, his body locked, but something deeper, primal, yanked him back into motion. He dove into the driver's seat, slammed the car into gear, and sped away without daring to look in the rearview mirror. That stench followed him, clung to the inside of the car like smoke from a fire that never happened. He didn't stop driving until the woods were miles behind. Didn't go home. Just pulled over at a quiet gas station by the tracks and sat there frozen, with sweat soaking through his uniform, watching the hood of his cruiser steam under the cold streetlight. Dawn broke gray and thin. Alan stood up, walked into the sheriff's office, and turned in his badge without a word. He didn't try to explain. He didn't need to. Whatever he saw in Cinderbrush Hollow, it broke something in him that couldn't be put back together. But that wasn't the part that haunted me. It was what came after, what they found on his cruiser, and what they didn't. Because just when everyone thought the story was over, it wasn't. The rain hadn't fallen that night, but the forest felt wet, like it had been sweating. Lewis County, tucked in the shadow of the Cascades, had seen its fair share of wilderness reports over the years. Missing livestock, flickering lights deep between the trees, shapes that didn't match any native species, but nothing that ever stuck, nothing that ever made a man like Alan Ree flinch. He'd done his time in the Army, taken medals for rescues during winter floods, even once tracked a cougar on foot for 2 days without backup. The man was steady, pragmatic, methodical, and yet, on that one late shift, with the road behind him swallowed by dark, and the only sound a soft groan of tires on gravel, he made a decision that would alter the shape of his life completely. He turned onto the Cinderbrush service path. No sirens, no rush. Just routine, There'd been some recent calls, muffled banging from the woods at night, a few missing sheep, claw marks on a stable door, but nothing concrete. His colleagues brushed it off. Wolves, maybe a black bear, they'd said. But Alan didn't like loose ends, and the hollow didn't sit right with him. The deeper he drove, the tighter the trees pressed, thickening like muscle around a wound. He cut the radio, rolling through a corridor of damp pine and shadow. Then he saw it. At first it looked like a hitchhiker, a tall one, but as his cruiser rounded the bend and his headlights locked onto the figure, Alan hit the brakes so hard the cruiser jolted. It wasn't human, not even close. It stood upright, yes, but its shoulders were too wide, its arms too long, and the eyes, when they reflected back at him, were too flat. The thing was soaked in black fur, hanging like algae from its limbs, and its chest moved slow, like it didn't need to breathe often. Alan's hand hovered over his holster, but he didn't move. Neither did it. Seconds passed like entire winters. Then, quietly, methodically, Alan opened the door. The metal creaked as his boot hit the gravel. His other foot followed. He stepped forward once, twice, never taking his eyes off the thing. That was when it lunged. Not at him, but to the side, grabbing a fallen tree limb as thick as a railroad tie and hurling it in one impossible arc, straight at the cruiser. Glass exploded. The hood buckled. The impact screamed like metal being peeled open, and for one fractured second, Alan understood. If he had stepped forward just a beat faster, he would have died right there. And then, out of nowhere, it smelled like burning blood, like iron that had been cooked too long. His stomach turned. The trees behind the creature shimmered, not with wind, but with wrongness, as if space itself had hiccuped. Shadows danced in ways that made no earthly sense. The lights of the cruiser flickered and his legs locked beneath him. But then something took over, pure animal survival. He flung himself into the seat, jammed the gear into reverse, then drive, peeling out with tires spitting gravel into the trees. He didn't look back. He couldn't. The air inside the cruiser felt alive with heat and scent and something he couldn't name, something watching. He didn't stop until he hit the edge of the county. Didn't turn the engine off until he reached that little gas station by the abandoned tracks, the one with the single light that always buzzed like a fly trapped in glass. He sat there, knuckles bone white on the steering wheel, feeling every nerve in his body scream. Morning was still hours away, but when it came, so did the end of something in Alan Ree. And what none of us knew, not then, was that the worst wasn't over. It hadn't even begun. The cruiser hissed as it cooled beneath the buzz of that old sodium lamp, its cracked windshield catching faint reflected ice. Alan hadn't moved, his shoulders locked, breathing shallow, hands still braced on the steering wheel. The adrenaline had drained, but something else lingered, something heavier. The way he sat there, you'd think he was afraid to open the door, as if the thing from the woods had followed him, pressed invisible against the glass. Waiting. Minutes passed, maybe hours. No one came, just the low hum of the streetlight and the distant sound of wind pushing against the empty tracks beyond the gas station. And then, without drama or delay, Alan got out, walked inside. No report. He returned the cruiser to the department lot just before sunrise and left it there. Hood still warped like a crushed can, windshield veined with cracks. The smell clung to the interior. Scorched metal, something bitter beneath it, like old coins soaked in vinegar. He didn't even change his uniform, just marched into the sheriff's office, placed his badge on the desk and handed over a typed resignation letter. One sentence long: I can no longer perform my duties due to health and stress. That was it. No follow-up, no elaboration. He didn't wait to be asked. What unsettled the others most wasn't the suddenness. It was how calm he seemed. Pale, sure, haggard, but not panicked. Like a man who had made peace with a secret too big to tell. He went home briefly, just long enough to pull down the blinds and begin packing. Neighbors knocked. Nobody answered. What they saw made their stomachs knot. The dents weren't from impact the way most collisions leave them. They looked pressed inward by something wide, dense, and uneven. No bark, no splinters. Just warped metal and streaks that shimmered slightly, like something corrosive had grazed it. The mark was far too high for a bear, and it curved, not like a claw, but the limb had vanished. No debris on sight, no moisture trail, no rot or break points from a fall, and no one questioned it, at least not aloud. What Alan didn't say became louder than anything he could have explained to the few people he trusted, mostly old SAR partners who'd hiked frozen riverbeds and outpaced mountain lions. He didn't use terms like creature or man. He only said one thing: not at night, not at all. There was no dramatics, no outbursts. But those who heard him said his voice had a weight they'd never noticed before, like it was trying to hold something back. 3 days later, he sold his truck, closed his bank accounts, left behind everything but a few boxes and some worn gear. No forwarding address. Some believe he went south, across the Oregon border. Others think he rented a cabin in a field with no trees for miles. One man swore he saw him at a bait shop, 2 counties over, buying only batteries and a shortwave radio. Wherever he went, one thing was certain. He made damn sure it was nowhere near Cinderbrush Hollow. And deep in the bones of that forest, silence returned like nothing had ever happened. But it had, and it wasn't done. The cruiser didn't stay in the lot long. 2 days after Alan vanished, a department mechanic rolled it into the back bay for inspection. He wasn't told much, just that the vehicle needed repairs before being reassigned. The mechanic, a former auto body tech with 20 years under his belt, took one look at the damage and frowned. The dents didn't track. The hood had been crumpled inward, not from above, but as if something had struck it from the front, wide and blunt. The windshield was spider-webbed, yes, but not shattered from inside pressure like a deployed airbag, and there was no mud, no bark residue, no broken branch, nothing to match the official report. It was as though the object that hit it had never existed. He took pictures, made notes, filed them away. Most of the staff never saw those photos, but the few who did talked quietly among themselves. The markings near the bumper were subtle, at first glance just warps in metal, but when the light hit right, they looked like impressions, wide, fingered, as if something massive had leaned its hand onto the cruiser, steadying itself as it stared inside. And that's when things started getting stranger. One deputy swore that, late one night during a storm, the garage motion sensor clicked on with no one inside. The lights buzzed to life. Nothing moved. But when they checked the camera feed the next day, the image glitched. Just for a second, a frame dropped. The cruiser in frame, then not. The shadow of it shifted slightly, like something had passed between the car and the lens, but left no outline. They laughed it off, blamed it on the wiring weather interference. Still after that, no one liked going near the car after dark. Meanwhile, the woods around Cinderbrush Hollow went quiet. Too quiet. The usual owl calls disappeared. Dogs wouldn't go near the trailheads. One local, a retired logger named Deke, claimed he saw movement one evening from his back porch. Something tall slipping between trees faster than a man could run. He said it didn't make a sound. He said the deer that used to drink from the stream out back had stopped coming entirely. But it wasn't until the hunters started pulling out that people noticed something was wrong. 2 bow hunters, brothers from Spokane, cut their trip short after spending just one night at the trail camp north of the hollow. They didn't bring back any game. They didn't even pack up properly. They just left. One of them mentioned hearing a sound like breathing, but bigger, wider, coming from all directions. The other refused to talk about it at all. Just said, "There's something still out there," and shut the tailgate. And then came the dogs. One morning, an older man living a few miles west of the hollow found his German shepherd trembling at the front door, refusing to go down the steps. He said the animal had dirt on its paws, like it had tried to dig under the fence, not out of a boredom, out of panic. That night, it barked at the trees until sunrise, but never once crossed the yard. What no one said out loud, but everyone was starting to feel, was that whatever Alan saw wasn't just passing through. It hadn't moved on. It had stayed. Or worse, it had always been there, waiting, just beyond the lights, just past the reach of the road. And while some of the townsfolk clung to skepticism, others, those who'd heard things, felt things, began to lock their doors earlier, turn on porch lights that hadn't worked in years. But lights won't help you. if the thing watching from the trees doesn't need darkness. And that was the truth no one wanted to admit. Because sometimes the forest doesn't hide something new. Sometimes it stops hiding something old. It didn't take long for the whispers to shift from Alan's disappearance to the cruiser itself. People started asking quiet questions. Why hadn't the department released a damage report? Why had the car been pulled from service so fast? The official line, struck by a falling branch during patrol, didn't sit well with folks who'd seen the wreck firsthand. One of the old mechanics, who'd worked the department garage for nearly a decade, mentioned to a friend over coffee that the frame had dents from two angles, one from above, but the other from the front and low, like a battering ram that came from a crouched position. He didn't say more, just shook his head, said that wasn't any tree limb and left it there. But the quiet got louder. It always does in a small town. One evening at the local bar, a young deputy named Will, barely 6 months on the job, had one too many and let something slip. He'd been on inventory duty the night the cruiser was brought in, said when he opened the back hatch to log contents. The cabin reeked of something off. Not like mildew, not like smoke. He described it as hot pennies soaked in sulfur. His gloves picked up the smell. Said he couldn't wash it off for days. He swore the plastic in the rear seat had started to pucker, like it had been exposed to high heat, but there'd been no fire, no burns. And then he said the part that made the others go quiet. He found a single long hair wedged in the interior seam of the front seat. Black, coarse, longer than any dog's. He didn't turn it in. He burned it, and that should have been the worst of it. But it wasn't, because 2 weeks later, an officer from a nearby town, Castle Rock, reached out unofficially. They'd gotten a call from a woman living just north of the hollow's edge. She'd said her horses had been agitated for days, wouldn't feed, kicked at stall doors. That night, something had passed by her property. She hadn't seen it, but she'd heard it. Heavy, bipedal, and she found a print the next morning. It was half in mud, half on gravel. No pads, no paw marks. Just 5 digits, wide as her palm, and spaced too far apart to be human. The officer showed up, took a photo, but the impression had already started to collapse. He emailed it to the department. The file was quietly flagged, then deleted. Tensions rose. The sheriff's office never reopened Alan's incident. Not officially. Not even after one of their own filed a complaint about unusual late-night disturbances near the southern trailhead. The words were vague, purposely so, but they were written by a sergeant with 15 years on the force, someone who didn't scare easily. He noted the trees there had begun leaning slightly, like they were growing crooked overnight, said he'd seen lights in the fog, heard what he called dry breathing. When asked what that meant, he said, like something trying to breathe in a world that wasn't made for it. And just when it seemed the story might settle, when people started pretending, maybe it had all been nerves and coincidence, something changed in the hollow itself. The birds came back, but only in the day. Coyotes started avoiding the area entirely. And then, on a late September morning, 2 hikers from Seattle stopped by the ranger station. They looked shaken, not injured, but pale. They claimed they'd gotten lost off trail near dusk, said they heard something walking in parallel with them for nearly a mile. They never saw it, but every time they stopped, so did it. Every time they whispered, it came closer. The woman said she caught a glimpse in the dying light. Something leaning between 2 trees, too big, too still. It wasn't breathing, she said, but I felt it, like pressure in my teeth, like being underwater. The ranger let them go without making a scene. But as they drove off, he pulled out an old map and marked their sighting in red. It overlapped perfectly with the trail that led straight into the heart of Cinderbrush Hollow. And beneath his breath, with no one else around, he muttered one word, again, because the pattern wasn't random anymore. It was forming, growing, and something, somewhere in those woods, had never left. It was waiting for night, for silence, for someone else to walk a little too far, stay out a little too long, the kind of someone who wouldn't be missed until morning. The pattern deepened. It wasn't just stories anymore. It was behavior. The woods had shifted. Locals noticed it first in subtle ways. Trails that used to feel calm and open now seemed narrower, overgrown faster than usual, as if the forest itself was pulling in. Light didn't linger the same way. A strange hush hung in the trees, not just the absence of noise, but a pressure behind the silence, like something listening. Hunters stopped setting up blinds near cinderbrush. Even seasoned trackers refused to follow prints that led beyond the tree line. "It's not worth it," one man muttered to his son, dragging their gear back to the truck. "If something doesn't want to be seen, don't go looking." But it wasn't fear keeping people away anymore. It was respect, uneasy, reluctant, ancient respect, as if the hollow had taken something from Alan Ree that night, and the forest itself had absorbed it. His presence, his decision. The moment he turned away and ran, he'd left behind more than a patrol route. He'd left an offering. Most came back shaken but unhurt. One group didn't speak for hours after returning, and when pressed, one girl said, barely above a whisper, the trees weren't still. That was all, and she wouldn't say it again. A wildlife officer named Hayes, stationed out of Morton, took it upon himself to monitor the hollow unofficially. He hiked the outer trails, placed motion sensor cameras, logged animal patterns. For weeks, nothing unusual. Then, during a check in late October, he found one of his cameras twisted sideways on its mount. High up, too high for a bear. The housing wasn't broken. The lens wasn't cracked. It had simply been turned. When he pulled the memory card, he expected static. Instead, there was just one video file. Only 30 seconds long. Black and white infrared footage. First silence. Then trees swaying gently in the breeze. Then movement. Not a creature. A shape. Too large for a man. Upright. Close to the lens. Too close to focus. But you could make out one detail before the clip ended. It blinked. Not eyes. One eye. Wide, luminous. Alien and yet familiar. Like a wolf's in full moonlight, but deeper. Slower. Aware. Hayes never filed that footage. He deleted. Then, he left his post. No warning, no goodbye, just gone. And when someone asked one of his co-workers where he might have gone, the man just shook his head and said, "Far. Somewhere with open sky. Somewhere where the trees don't bend when there is no wind." By now, the county had stopped pretending. Unofficially, the trailhead signs near cinderbrush were removed. For maintenance, the bulletin said, but no work crews ever came. The sheriff's department stopped sending new recruits near the region. The cruiser, the one Alan drove that night, was quietly sold off at auction. Unlisted and unlogged. Where it ended up, no one knows. A few believe it was destroyed. Others think it was taken, locked away somewhere beneath a different jurisdiction. Because some things once seen can't be unsaid. And even if Alan Ree never spoke a word about that night again, the truth had already spread. Not through headlines, not through files, but through the air itself, like a storm waiting for another body to step into it. And somewhere deep in that storm, something still remembers being seen. And it does not forget. Years later, Alan Ree's name is still passed around in low voices, at the edge of potluck tables, in hunging cabins when the wind outside starts to hum. In late-night shifts when dispatch goes quiet and you're alone with the dark. He was never declared unfit, never wrote a memoir, never claimed trauma or sought the kind of spotlight other men chase when they've seen something they can't explain. He just left, as if the weight of what stood in those headlights wasn't something to conquer or contain, but something to walk away from while you still could. His cruiser was sold, his house rented out, his name erased from rotation like he'd been reassigned to nowhere. But his silence stuck. It gave the story shape. It gave it teeth. There are still no official sightings logged out of Cinderbrush Hollow. Wildlife authorities maintain it's a dead zone. Low prey, low predator density. They blame seasonal droughts, climate shift, natural migration. But the locals don't believe that. Not anymore. Because things haven't returned to normal. Not really. Not when the trees still tilt ever so slightly toward the trail as if listening. Not when dogs go stiff at the edge of the road, hackles up, refusing to cross even for treats. And not when grown men, hunters, loggers, deputies, begin a sentence with, "I heard something last night," and never finish it. and it leaves a question. The kind that lingers long after the story's told. What did Alan see? What did it want? Was it always there, or did something call it? And if he hadn't stopped that night, if his foot hadn't hit the brake, if the lights hadn't caught that shape, would we even know it was real? Or worse, is that the only reason it noticed us? Some say it's just a story. Others say it explains what they've always felt but never said aloud. What do you think? Tell me. Or better yet, if you've ever felt something watching you just beyond the trees, when there shouldn't have been anything there at all, maybe it's time we start listening to the silence between the branches. Because sometimes the things we're afraid to name are the ones that already know ours. Out there, beyond the comfort of fences and firelight, lie places the maps still mark, but our hearts no longer claim. Places where the forest doesn't just grow, it remembers. It holds things that can't be measured by trail markers or satellite images. And maybe, just maybe, it waits for the quietest moments to remind us that we're not alone. Not in the way we once thought. We live in a world where we often pretend we've figured everything out. We build walls and routines to keep uncertainty out. But what if some truths still exist outside those boundaries? What if there are corners of this earth that don't belong to us? Places that don't care about explanation, only presence. And in those rare silent encounters, maybe we're not meant to understand. Maybe we're meant to respect, to listen, to learn how to feel again. Because at the heart of every tale like this, every whisper of something just beyond the trees, isn't just fear. It's awe. It's the deep ancient knowledge that the world is still wild, still mysterious, still sacred. And in that mystery, there's something beautiful. A reminder that humility is strength. That not everything needs proof to be real. That sometimes the most powerful response is to simply acknowledge we don't know and choose to walk carefully anyway. We're all walking paths, some well-lit, some uncertain, and some that feel like they were never meant to be touched. The question isn't whether the path is safe, it's whether we're listening as we move through it. Are we hearing what the land is telling us? Are we aware of the silence when it grows too perfect? Of the cold chill that rises not from weather, but from instinct? And in the end, maybe that's the point. That the unknown isn't always here to harm us. Sometimes it's here to humble us, to remind us that we're part of something far older, deeper, and larger than we'll ever fully understand. And that's okay. Thank you for walking this path with me tonight. If this story stirred something in you, curiosity, memory, maybe even a personal encounter, you're not alone. Share your thoughts down below. I'd love to hear what you believe, or what you felt but never had the words to say. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications if you want more true tales from the edge of the known world. There's always another story just beyond the next tree.